Thank you so much for being here on the Emotional Leads podcast with me today. I know you're going to love today's episode. I interviewed Jenn Huber, who is not only a registered dietitian, but a naturopathic doctor. I invited Jenn to the show because I love the way she communicates how women can actually find more compassion for themselves around food, their bodies, and aging, especially in menopause. She explains the concept of undieting and why that might be important for women to do before they consider intuitive eating and other ways of eating. We talk a lot about the underlying causes for needing to have the control around food, have the food rules and dieting, including safety and belonging. I love our conversation around acceptance of where we are in our lives in midlife. And I also asked her to debunk some of the information that we see online from registered dietitians, but also around intuitive eating. We talk about one of my favorite phrases from Jenn, which is food can be a form of self care instead of self improvement. I can't thank Jenn enough for being here to really bring great tips and compassion to women who are struggling with dieting and food issues in midlife, and I know you are going to love her. Help us out by downloading the episode, subscribing, and just letting us know what you think. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Jenn. Thank you so much for joining me on the Emotional Leads podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Kim.
Well, I'm really excited because I was just telling you offline, I love how you are communicating to women and women who are going through menopause, eating struggles, the years of dieting. There's so much information that you have to share, but you're really compassionate about it. And I really appreciate that about you. So thank you, first of all.
Oh, thank you. It's so kind.
I'm excited because I want to dig in a little bit. And before we get into your professional side, I really would love to know more about you, even just growing up. What was it like for you growing up? What was food like? What was health like? What were you like as a little girl before you even decided what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question, and I'll explain why in a moment. But so I grew up in a small town in a province of Canada, New Brunswick, and my dad was the local obstetrician. We moved there when I was 9 months old, but it was a fine place to grow up. But we always kind of felt, I guess, like outsiders, and especially because I found out later in life. So 6 or 7 years ago now, I found out that I'm actually donor conceived. And so a lot of my life growing up, I felt like I didn't fit in. And so in over the last few years, I've been kind of reimagining and reinventing that identity with this new information. And so a lot of my teen years were angsty, as many of them are, but it was also about me trying to fit in ways that I couldn't understand then, which was unfortunately at the start of my disordered relationship with food, which eventually led to what I do now and why I became so passionate about not just nutrition, but that relationship with food piece. And when I went into early perimenopause around 37 and was menopausal by 44, that really kind of aligned with how I wanted to move forward with my professional work.
Oh, that's perfect. You actually answered both questions for me. I think when we find out information, that's really a whole new processing because not knowing it, and I find that amazing too, that when you were younger, your body and your
Yeah.
mind knew something was different and it was maybe beyond what the normal not belonging felt like for
Yeah.
teenagers. And isn't that really some of the core root causes for why we use food is that safety and that belonging?
Yeah.
So that's
And the really
powerful.
interesting thing is since discovering this information, which I've been really open about and talked about it, pretty much everywhere, because I think it's important to just open up those secrets. Since discovering this, I've met many of my donor conceived family. And, it really helped to align what was missing so that it was like pieces of a puzzle coming together and really being able to see the parts of me represented in these people was really healing in many ways.
That's really powerful. And I'm really happy for you that you were able to meet them. And you said something really important there about this alignment and what we're missing. let's dig into midlife women,
Yeah, let's do
women
that.
over 40. Let's dig in. What do you think women are missing right now that causes them to lean on? We'll get really into diet culture and all those things, but what are we missing that makes us lean into all these external things?
Oh, that's a big question. Let me think about that for a second. Um, I ask the question, what is the missing ingredient in midlife on my podcast? So I'm kind of, including some of those answers in my thoughts. But one of the things that is not missing is more information, meaning more information about food. Most people think that what they need is more information about how to eat and what not to eat. And I almost always tell people, you actually need less information, you need a better filter. And so most people are looking for what should I eat information. You don't need that. Anybody who is a functioning adult in this world actually could probably write a reasonably accurate book about what is a healthy diet, right? What I really think is missing is role models. I think that we need to see role models who are thriving in midlife and beyond. And we know from the research that women in postmenopause report being happier than their premenopausal selves. And so this conversation and this narrative around aging and getting old and the best years are over, that needs to change, because once we start to think about this season of life that we're in and that we're going to live a third, maybe more of our life as postmenopausal women, it's very easy to connect, or it's easier to connect to a relationship with food and movement that is focused on how we want to feel and not entirely focused on how we want to look. So I think hopefully that answers your question.
I think that's great. I think we're almost missing. I feel from what you just said, makes me think of us missing listening to ourselves and trusting ourselves,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
we can get a 5-second blurb every second on this, Instagram, TikTok, wherever, and we latch on to the 5 tips. We latch on to the one food we should eat instead of really listening to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's powerful. I really like that. I would love for you to share too. In addition, this is actually leading right into my next question. We are in an age of those of us who are in our 50s, 60s. I know there's younger people listening, but dieting literally I think I dieted for probably on and off for 25 years.
Yeah.
And 25 years is actually almost half of my lifetime if you think about it. And I know so many other women who've done that. But we have this ingrained path in our brains that leads us right back there. And you use a term called undieting. And I would
Yeah.
love for you to really share what that is so we can lead into that conversation, because it's almost like I always think of it as the old turntable with the record and the scratch, and the needle is in the scratch and it can't get out until somebody
Yeah.
helps you bump it out of there. So what is undieting?
And I love that analogy of the needle on the record. And so before we talk about undieting, I think it's helpful to explain how I explain this programming that we have and how the programming works. So when a computer program is being run, we have assumptions that drive the script, as it were. And then the script runs, and then a product or something is spit out on the other side. If there's something wrong in the script and it doesn't match with the assumptions, you're going to run into what I call a syntax error. Full disclosure, I have never written a computer program in my life, but this is how I understand it to be true. So I don't want anyone to tell me that I'm wrong. I'm just kidding. But so what happens when people get to this place of, I cannot start another diet because I've been dieting for 25 years, 35 years, 50 years, and I know it doesn't work. I know to the core of my being and my lived experience that this is not going to work. When they get to that point, often what they do is they just stop dieting, which is great. Super important first step. But they often end up in this messy middle because they're not dieting, but they're just treading water. They don't know actually how to see the other side that they're trying to get to. They don't know what direction to turn. They often get pulled back into the current of, the diet cycle. They kind of just feel like they're spinning their wheels. So what I describe is one of the most important things that you do after you get to a place of peace and a little bit of peace and comfort when you've kind of recovered from those years of dieting, but you're starting to think like, okay, what's next? How can I actually move this process forward? We have to unwind. We have to undiet the learning. We have to work on changing the assumptions that your script is running on. Otherwise, if you're just running an intuitive eating script in place of a diet script, but you haven't worked on the assumptions about health and body and nutrition and your values and what is important to you, it's never going to feel like it's never going to feel like a well-oiled machine. Lots of us who dieted for many years got really good at it. It wasn't effective, but the process, the script that we were running, we never got the product, the output that we wanted, but the script was, it was a very well-oiled machine, counting calories, measuring, portioning, all of those, following the rules. So you can't just slap a new script on top. You really have to say, okay, what was this script running on? What were those assumptions? Are they true for me? Are they true for anyone? Do I still believe in them? Because once we change the assumptions, it's so much easier to just run a simple script. I'm hungry. What do I want? Put food on my plate, eat, end of meal, done. Because that's what people want. They want to get to that place of, I just want food to be easy. I want it to be enjoyable. I don't want to worry about it all the time. But you can't just do that by changing the rules. You have to change the assumptions. So that is undieting at its core.
I love that. You're really deconstructing the thought process of dieting and that culture and that groove. And I do love the computer analogy. I think that's great. I am not a computer programmer either, obviously,
So
but I
nobody
get
thinks we're wrong.
it. No, but I get it. I think that dieting, deconstructing is really important because what we do to solve our problems is we take the new best thing and we slap it on top of an old idea that's never been taken apart inside. And that is the tracking, the macros, the calories, the putting it into MyFitnessPal, the tracking every minute of exercise. Hopefully the calories that I did are going to outweigh everything that I ate. And there is no pleasure. There is no pleasure at all. I would love to talk about the tracking and the controlling part of this.
Yeah.
What do you think we as women are trying to control when we are so into these food rules and the tracking?
I think that for many of us, it is a source of comfort because especially when we're going through midlife. I mean, this is true in any stage, but when you're going through midlife and you're going through that experience of waking up in a body that you don't recognize, everything feels like it's changing. Your clothes aren't fitting, and what I tell people is that even if the scale isn't changing, not that I want anybody using a scale, but even if the scale isn't changing, what you see in the mirror and how your clothes will fit will change for most of us. Because of the hormone changes, we take on more of an apple shape compared to a pear shape. And so, this awful term meno belly that we see all over the place, it kind of happens to everyone. It's not because you had a bagel for breakfast. So, one of the hardest things I think for us to really accept is that we don't have as much control over what our body looks like as we have been led to believe by diet culture, wellness culture, and all the people telling us that weight is a behavior. So we want to regain some of that control, but those numbers are a false prophet because the calculations of how much you need have pretty big margins of error. The calculations of the nutrition label that is telling you how many grams of something is in, a package also has up to a 20% margin of error. So we're relying on this data that isn't actually as accurate as we think it is, and it can't do what we think it can do. But I think it all comes down to, for many of us, dieting was it was a way that we responded to those feelings. It was a habit. It was a way to manage the uncomfortable feelings of feeling uncomfortable in our body. And until we undiet that, until we change that programming, that script can keep running in the background even.
Oh, such good points. And yes, I had even forgotten about that. The 20% error that
Yeah.
can happen on any part of that label is really interesting. to me, it's not scary anymore. When I was dieting, of course, that's a scary thought. But now to me, it's just interesting because we have
Yeah.
held onto those beliefs for so long that we could control every factor. And then, of course, bringing in hormones and bringing in all of our
Yeah.
systems and our gut. There's so many different factors, our brain. I really appreciate that. And you mentioned the scale. And I think
Hmm.
the scale is such a unfortunately powerfully negative force for many women, and they spend a lot of their time thinking about a weight that they once were or a target weight,
Hmm.
in addition to what you were saying about not expecting that our bodies will change over time. We get to this point where we feel like we should be the same time, year after year after year. And thanks unfortunately to the media and social media, we're seeing the
Hmm.
small percentage of people whose bodies maybe do stay the same,
Yeah.
and those are the ones that they're going to post. But let's talk about the scale and what women are attached to versus what maybe they could be using in order to know what's going on, feel progress, if they even need progress. I'm not even saying everyone has to go into that self-improvement mode, but
Hmm.
what else do we have besides the scale that can help us?
And I mean, the scale is a culturally accepted way of validating our worth and our existence. And there's only two reasons why people get on the scale. And that is because they think they've lost weight and they're looking to validate that. And because they don't trust that they're feeling better, they need to see a number they've outsourced that belief. And the other reason is that we worry that we've gained weight and we're looking for a reason to motivate, shame, or punish ourselves into trying harder tomorrow. So the scale is not helpful in that it's not going to motivate you. It's not going to give you intrinsic motivation to eat more vegetables. It's going to give you extrinsic motivation to eat low calorie food. And that's never going to feel good. So extrinsic motivators are terrible motivators, right? We like shiny things, but only in the short term. And after a while, we kind of get tired of them and we want the next shiny thing. So when we're trying to get rid of the scale, I think what we're really trying to talk about is how do we build body trust? How can we learn to reconnect to how do I feel when I'm eating regularly foods that I enjoy and moving my body as often as I can in a way that's fun, that I want to do for reasons other than managing that calorie in, calorie out equation. So I like to bring it back to, what's your energy like? Do you feel like you have the energy and interest to do the things that you want to do? Maybe in midlife, people have some health markers. So maybe there are things like blood pressure or cholesterol that we might be looking at that we can also use as a measure, not a measure of good or bad success or failure, but just as a measure of like, okay, how is this relationship with food working for you? Do you feel like this is sustainable? And so much of the work that we're doing is embodiment work. When people are letting go of food rules and the scale and all of those external measures, we're really working on, okay, how can we help you to feel comfortable and safe in your body? But that has to be based on a real understanding that bodies do change. I mean, my hair has more gray than you can see today, and I accept that. I also accept that right now I still enjoy dyeing it because I like the color of it, but I accept that it's happening. I'm not denying it, fighting it. It doesn't upset me. And if I could never dye my hair again, I would be okay with that because I accept that the process is happening. And, the same as with wrinkles and, all of those other signs of, gaining wisdom. And so I think one of the hardest things to do when people are trying to let go of the scale is accepting that bodies change. So again, kind of those assumptions and programming, it's a lot easier to accept something that you know to be true. But diet culture tells us that we can fight it, that if we, that we can maintain that, thin fountain of youth forever. And for most people, that's never been accessible, but certainly not accessible as we get older.
I love also how you are including aging in diet
Mhm.
culture because it really is a societal pressure to not
Yeah.
only look a certain way and have a body of a 25-year-old, but also not to age. And
Yeah.
I really love the word acceptance. When we accept what's going on, it doesn't matter what you choose to do, you get to do it. Dye your
Yeah.
hair, get Botox, whatever your choices are, it's great. But you're accepting that this is what's happening to the
Yeah.
body. And that's so
And you're not
great.
wasting energy fighting it.
Right.
That's the
And
thing, is it
yes,
takes so much energy to fight something that is, you know, that you can't fight. We can't live forever. Like we can't.
right, right. And that
Um,
resistance really
yeah,
creates suffering. And I think
it
that's
does.
where some suffering
Absolutely.
comes from, is when we resist what it
Absolutely.
is. Absolutely. I love that. I would love to kind of segue a little bit into intuitive eating, because we were
Yeah.
talking about embodiment, listening to ourselves. And we both know that there are a lot of people who feel like intuitive eating is, oh, I can just, have as many donuts or cookies. There's really no limit. We're just whatever I feel. Can you please share a little bit more about intuitive eating so we can understand what that really means?
Yeah. And so when we talked about undieting and not dieting, the next step is intuitive eating. So a lot of people try and jump into intuitive eating straight from dieting and diet culture. And some people can do that. But I think for a lot of people, that undieting and deprogramming needs to happen first, so that we're kind of starting with a fresher, clean slate. So intuitive eating is a framework developed by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch more than 30 years ago now, I believe. And it really is just an anti-diet mentality based framework for learning to listen and honor your body's need for food and movement, that respects your individuality, like it respects that, your genetics are different than my genetics. And that's a big influence on what we look like, upwards of 60% based on twin studies. But at its core, it's teaching people to ditch the diet mentality. So we're not trying to think about good, bad, yes, no, always, never. We're really trying to lean into, when am I hungry? So understanding the types of hunger, including emotional hunger, in honoring and respecting taste hunger. We're human beings. We're hardwired to enjoy food that tastes good. We don't need to demonize or pathologize that. We need to have that as part of a healthy relationship with food. But we can also kind of work on choosing foods with some intention. So intuitive does not mean automatic, which is what I think some of the misconceptions about intuitive eating are. It's that, you'll kind of just sit there with your eyes closed and you can like channel a crystal ball and it will tell you what you should eat. That's not what intuitive eating is. Intuitive eating can still include some intention, which is where gentle nutrition comes in. So gentle nutrition is saying, is there something that I need to add to my plate for adequacy, balance, variety, nutrition, in a way that isn't prescriptive or rule based? And is it focused on how I want to feel and maybe some, other health related goals versus managing that calorie in, calorie out equation? So that's kind of a Cole's Notes version of intuitive eating.
I love that. I think it's interesting too. I'm glad you brought up the physical and emotional hunger, because one is very satisfying when we eat, and the other one's not really satisfying
Yeah.
after that first hit of getting that food. And understanding and giving grace, I think with the intuitive eating, we have to have a lot of compassion with ourselves. It doesn't just happen overnight like the
No, it
undieting.
doesn't.
Yeah, that's
People always
wonderful.
want to know, how long is it going to take? And while I can't ever answer that, specifically, I do say that I think a year is a good time frame to allot for kind of the work, as it were, because you need time to not only learn, but to try things on and to see what does and doesn't work, to see where adjustments need to be made. Sometimes life just happens and you just need to press pause and stay where you're at. So when I welcome people into my community, they can join for a month, but I really do try and convince them to stay, to try the year, like commit to the year from the beginning, so that you're just giving yourself that grace of, I'm going to learn at my own pace. I don't have to speed run it. But what I usually find is that it's like these bursts of, a couple of months and then some quiet as they're internalizing and processing, and then they come back and we're trying other things on. So I think that with intuitive eating, everybody can do it. Some people will say, oh, I tried it and it's not for me. I'm not going to say that someone's experience isn't true, but 99% of the time they were just not dieting. And that's very different than intuitive eating.
Oh, yes. And I think because of the years of dieting, that's why women ask those questions. How long will it take? Because we're usually guaranteed the 10-pound loss in a month or,
Yeah.
whatever the timeframes are that are out there to sell a program. We are expected to have that fix in a certain amount of time. And everybody is different in how they process because this is not just a physical situation that they're going through. I know you talk a lot about the mindset of it too. Our
Yeah.
brain has to shift. And I'm curious, what do you think are some of the things that people are bringing in, getting down on a little deeper level here, bringing in from their past and their childhood that is making it either easier or more challenging to break free?
Mm. I think probably the most common story that I hear, especially when people are finding it challenging, is not being accepted for what their body looked like as a young child. And so, especially when that was coming from a caregiver, as well intentioned as I believe it was most of the time, if you're brought to Weight Watchers when you're 9, that really that stays with you. And so for a lot of the women that I work with in those situations, we're really talking about creating safety and creating safety for their inner child. Even, like, how would you talk to her differently? What would you say to her now, knowing what you know now? And so kind of healing from some of those things is, I think, an important part of the process for many, many people, because it's hard. And especially if you still have family members who are still very much indoctrinated in diet culture, who can't wait to tell you about the latest diet that they tried. So not being able to have firm boundaries around the diet culture people in your life can make it more challenging too. But I think, so not surprisingly, it's easier when we're not doing it alone. So, midlife can be complicated for lots of reasons. If you have kids, it's often a really busy time of life. Careers can be really busy. We're often living away from family and friends. It can just be hard to maintain community. Like when my kids were young, it was so easy to have friends and acquaintances and people that I saw at play groups and, dropping kids off for play dates. It felt like I had too much community and not enough time to myself. But now that I have teenagers and we, moved away from the city that we were in for so long, I find that I actually have to seek it out. But it doesn't matter what we're doing, whether it's learning to knit or whether it's learning to eat intuitively, having a community of people that you can just kind of walk the walk with and see the people who are 2 steps ahead of you, how they're managing problems that you might encounter, but also provide to support to the people who are maybe a little bit, behind you in your journey. So I think community and learning in community is one of the most powerful ways to ease any journey.
Yes, community is powerful. And in community like yours and mine, we create that safety that they're
Yeah.
looking for, that vulnerability. I think food, our issues around food are very shameful sometimes for people. And when you
Yeah.
create that environment that you're creating for them, it gives them the space to be able to talk about it because hiding it and trying to do all these things to fix it is underscoring some of the issues. So that's
Yeah.
really amazing. And you keep coming back to, I want to bring it back for the audience, this safety, this belonging. And I think it also ties into feeling like you can be authentically yourself because a lot of women, when you bring up boundaries, let's talk about, do you find that some of these women are also very used to taking care of others, people pleasing,
Oh, yeah.
not having their boundaries up?
Yeah. I mean, I think that our entire generation was really brought up in that you can do anything and everything. You just have to meet everyone else's expectations and, not have any time for yourself. So now that we're in midlife, we're like, wait a minute, that's not worked out so well. I'm reclaiming some of that time. I'm reclaiming some of those boundaries, but it is hard. It is hard when it comes to, changing that. one of the main reasons that people try to control what their body looks like is to control other people's opinions. And it's very easy to find 1,000 examples in our life of opinions that we don't care about. I don't care what someone thinks of my playlist. I don't care what someone thinks of the TV show that I watch. I don't care what someone thinks of my clothes, because we've reclaimed that confidence. And we can do the same thing with our bodies. We can get to a place where we're like, I don't care what someone thinks of my body. I'm not going to spend my life trying to create a body that is pleasing to someone else's eyes.
Yes. And I can't remember a time that I've gone out and seen a lot of women. I live in Florida, so going to the beach probably 3/4 of the year, there's not a bunch of bundling up and layering. We are right now, but not normally. And I've never looked at someone's body and walked away and 10 minutes later thought about that body again or
Exactly.
cared what they did. It's really amazing how that's become such a driving force when in actuality we wouldn't shame somebody else the way we shame ourselves over it. We would
Yeah.
never tell our friend some of the things that we tell ourselves about our bodies or that somebody in our family might have. But I really appreciate those thoughts on that. I'm going to take just a quick turn here. There's something that I've seen online, and I'm really excited to have you clarify this. When we are going through the post, there are a little bit of trolley comments and controversy around some registered dietitians who are saying, and I'm going to say this in a very vague way because I can't tell you a specific example, but
Yeah.
you will totally know where I'm going with it. Say you can have Coke, you can have candy, you can have all these things, and then you get these health, I'm putting in air quotes for those of you who can't see me, health experts. Could be anyone from a health coach to a doctor saying, why in the world would you want to spread this information? And I know there's a deeper meaning to it, and I would love to give you the platform to explain that.
And I love that you brought that up, because most, hopefully all, intuitive eating dietitians practice from a food neutrality place. That, food is food. We eat it for different reasons. We enjoy it for different reasons. Some food gives us more nutrition than others, but it doesn't mean that one is good and one is bad, right? And if we want people to have a normal relationship with food that doesn't create reward, restriction, fear, we need to stop saying that there are good foods and bad foods. And so when we're saying that, yeah, of course, I mean, you can come to my house anytime and you'll see that our snack cupboard is full. You'll also see that our fruit bowl is always full and there's always veggies to snack on and there's all kinds of foods. But what I think the point that people are missing is that if we restrict anything, we want it more. That's human nature. And if we're trying to practice embodied intuitive eating that is focused on how we feel, most of us would quickly realize that if I ate chips and candy all day long, I'm not going to feel good. And because I have that intuitive embodied approach, I enjoy them when I have them, but that's not what I crave when I'm hungry and I want nourishment. So food, and I mean, sugar is not poison. Nobody, including me, is saying that we should be eating all of it all of the time. But it has to be, if you enjoy any food, it needs to be part of what you can choose. It needs to be an option for you to put on your plate when you want it. And if you practice permission, which is, permission to say yes or permission to say no, if you practice permission, it's very easy to lean into, do I want this? Instead of, am I allowed to have this? Because that is what creates the restriction and that's what creates the craving.
Oh, and I've always been a fan of permission to eat. It gives you, again, I'm like a naughty 5-year-old. If you tell me I can't have chocolate, there's no
Yeah.
way I'm not stopping on the way home to get me some chocolate. So
Yeah.
I get that. And I love that you said it's not just permission to say yes, but it's also permission to say no. And we really think a lot of times when we've been in diet culture for so long that we just can't say no. and that we have no willpower, we have no discipline. But when we realize we actually have permission to say no, it's not something that's a punishment to say no.
Mhm.
It really opens the door and the pathways in our brain that are so much more compassionate, relaxed, and peaceful. Because when we're in that state of fight or flight over food, of course we're going to be in some kind of battle and we're not going to win it.
And when we think that we're never going to have it again, that's where the last meal mentality kicks in, right? And so, I use the example of, let's say you're going on a car trip, and this definitely resonates for anybody midlife. But if we're getting in the car, Kim, and I say, okay, Kim, you're not going to be able to go to the bathroom for 8 hours. What are you going to do for the next 10 minutes before we start?
I am going to be freaking out.
Right. Same is true if I said, okay, you're not going to be able to have anything to drink for the next 12 hours. You're going to constantly be thinking about it. So when we impose rules and restriction, which diet culture calls moderation, it actually requires more energy to moderate something. So, our breaths, for example, most of us aren't counting or thinking about how many breaths that we take. But if our body is working well and we feel well, chances are we're taking the normal amount of breaths, right? But if I said, okay, let's try and only take 14 breaths a minute for the next 3 hours, then you can take as many as you want. But you have to earn it by only taking 14 breaths a minute for the next hour. How's that going to play out? You're going to spend so much time and energy thinking about it that you're just going to say, screw it. And you're going to take all the breaths when you want them. But then you're going to feel like you failed and you couldn't do it. So we really need to get away from the idea that we can prescribe rules around eating. They do not work. Full stop.
Jenn, you have the best analogies, by the way. It really makes it so easy because I'm sitting here thinking 8 hours without going to the bathroom or having something to drink or eat. I love that. That's such a great analogy. And this reminds me when we talk about this restriction, I was very guilty of this before I started the healing process and understanding why I did it. The binge restrict
Mm-hmm.
cycle. And actually, for me, it was the restrict binge cycle because I always started with the heavy dieting to have
Yeah.
that control. And then I would just give up and then I would end up binging. But my binging wasn't just because I was hungry because of the restriction. It was the failure of not sticking to it. I can't do anything right. There were so many other factors in there. The shame, it brought up other things that happened in my life. So can you speak to that binge restrict cycle and maybe even how can we look at it differently to even things out a little bit better?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the binge restrict cycle that starts with restriction is very common. I would say certainly in my experience, it is the more common of the two. And so what happens when we restrict access to any food or all foods, and especially if that means that we're spending more time feeling hungry than feeling satisfied, is that our brain starts to think about food more. So we have that wiring that says, oh, the little lizard that is driving, the hunger and the full and the appetite cues says, hey, we've been hungry for a while now. And actually, I think we should make all food seem really appealing, which is why after a period of restriction, a sleeve of rice cakes looks like gourmet snacks, even if you hate them in periods of time when you're eating adequately. So just the act of not eating to meet your needs will create increased appetite, which makes us want all food more. But the discomfort creates the emotional hunger. It is the discomfort of feeling that, that don't feel good enough, that we feel like we lack some kind of moral chip that everyone else has to be able to say no to things that taste good. And the constant thinking about it is what drives a lot of the emotional hunger. And emotional hunger is still hunger. We need to respond to it. And if the only tool in our toolbox to respond to emotional hunger is food, because that's the only way that we've learned or been taught, it can feel terrifying to think about not reaching for the food that has brought us comfort, which is why we always say food needs to be part of your self-care bucket, because it does feel good to eat. And there will be times when it's going to be the most accessible tool in your toolbox. And we want to have gratitude for that. But it doesn't have to be the only tool. And when we can learn to press pause without it feeling like we're saying no, we can then lean into, what do I really need in this moment? Do I need rest? Do I need comfort? Do I need connection? Do I need joy? What is at the root of my emotional hunger? And when dieting is at the root of that, then the obvious step is to get out of the diet cycle. And a lot of people find that their emotional eating was actually driven by the discomfort of dieting.
Yes, that's actually I find one of the biggest predictors of people emotional eating, women, and the other parts of it are the belonging, the safety,
Mm-hmm.
not
Yep.
having felt like you met expectations. So
Yep.
love that. And you have a phrase that I love that you just almost went into, that food is a form of self-care instead of self-improvement.
Yeah. And if we can start to think of it that way, because it's always like, what is the best food? What's good for me? What's going to help me do XYZ? That it becomes part of this self-improvement plan, like we're, building something. But we need to eat. We need to eat every day, multiple times a day for the rest of our lives, and often with other people in mind. So why shouldn't we bundle it in with our self-care? So self-care might mean, for me, like when my husband travels quite a bit for work, is having lots of frozen pizza and IKEA meatballs in the freezer. That's self-care. When I have more capacity and time and interest, my self-care is also cooking new recipes because I love to cook. Self-care is making my favorite muffins to have as a snack on a busy day. But it might also be going to buy my favorite snack at the store. So thinking about how can food be part of how we take care of ourselves, not just how do we nourish ourselves with nutrition.
I like that. And I like the idea of being able to look at something that is not necessarily what we've been taught is the most nourishing, but to know that it is self-care, because when we go into it with a different mindset, we're not coming out with the shame and the guilt,
Yeah.
which really just compounds the cycles and the patterns that we're in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, no
Yes.
good can come of it, right?
No good can come of it. So, Jen, I would love it if you could give us a few tips for some people who are really struggling out there. They haven't maybe made all the steps, but they're thinking about it. They're getting more open to changing the way they're looking at their bodies, dieting, aging. And it can be anything you've mentioned before or anything new. What are some things that you can share with us?
Well, one of the things that we're exploring a lot in my community is assessing our values. Because if we think about when we first entered adulthood, which I'm going to say is in our 20s for most of us, the values that I held at 23, 24, 25 are pretty different than where they're at almost 48. And when we think about those assumptions that we were talking about earlier, that default programming, values are a big part of that. So for anybody who feels like they're maybe not connected to themselves, they feel that this idea of embodied eating or intuitive eating feels really out of reach for them, spend some time doing some value assessments. And you can just Google ways to do that, but just kind of like, what is actually important to me, which also helps to set the stage for this next season of life. So, thinking about what's important to me now, but also what's important to me in 20 years from now. And then being able to look at your current relationship with food, which you may need to do with a professional. Like for a lot of people, I think that the self-help, this idea of being able to do everything on our own, doesn't help us. And so, connecting with a professional, especially if it feels scary, if it feels like it's really out of reach for you, like please don't do this alone. But just being able to look and say, like, is how I'm treating myself, my body, my mind, in line with my values now? Am I being kind and respectful? Am I honoring my body's needs? Or am I trying to push it in a direction that it just does not want to go? And so being able to do that values assessment, which will help you to align your script, what you want to do with your assumptions, I think can be really powerful because it gives you direction, right? It helps to make things clear, and you've created a set of internal motivations and that are uniquely yours and that are honoring what you want, not what you've been told you should want for your whole life. And then also just to enjoy food. Food is meant to be enjoyable. It is meant to be pleasurable. And one of the greatest joys that I see when I'm working with people is when they rediscover what they actually like, when they can get to that place of curiosity and playfulness of, oh my gosh, I get to choose things that I enjoy, not only the things that I think that are good for me. It can be a tremendous source of joy and pleasure, which we're sometimes lacking in midlife because of the life stage that we're at. So I would say that those are kind of the three things. Align your values, check in to see if what you're currently doing matches that, and just bring some curiosity and playfulness into your relationship with food and your body.
That's so powerful. And I love about enjoying food. Random side note, I remember being in my 20s and I went out on a date with someone and I chose the salad over pasta. I wanted that pasta so bad. I really wanted it. And it just seemed warm and what I wanted. But it was this assumption in my head about what I should have, what I should eat, and not just because of my weight and dieting, but because of what I socially thought
Yeah,
he would think if I dug into a big bowl of pasta.
yeah,
So I love that you said that. That always comes back to my mind, and aligning the values, because we do stand for different things now
yeah.
than what we did when we were younger. And the playfulness, that's such a great add in. I love that. Being a little more playful. We are very serious about our food rules.
Too serious.
Too serious. Food is great. Jenn, this has been such a pleasure, and I want everyone to find you. And if they want to look into your group, where can everyone catch up with you?
I mean, Instagram is always the best place to find me easily. So menopause.nutritionist. But the Midlife Feast community, and which is also the podcast, the Midlife Feast, is a great way to connect with like-minded people who are in the same age and stage, for anybody who's looking to change their assumptions or their script and feel like they don't have to go it alone.
Oh, that's great. And we'll put everything in the show notes. And
Thank
Jenn, I just want to thank you again, not only for the amazing information and the tips, but your compassion and really deeper understanding of what women are going through. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much.
And everyone, make sure you nourish your entire life and give yourself grace today.